As we move into lesson number 1, we will be reviewing the general archiving principles to help guide you through the initial steps of the archiving project. Number 1, to determine why to even begin to initiate an archiving project, and then secondly, who should be involved in the project. We'll begin this process by developing a mission statement to serve as an overriding guideline and a methodology for the entire archiving process. The first thing we want to establish in our archiving mission statement is that we will be implementing SAP best practices to properly remove and store old business data from the live system while maintaining database integrity. This is a very important concept to understand, and it doesn't matter whether we're archiving HR data or materials management data, production data, purchase orders, finance. All data has to be completely closed before it will be eligible to be archived. As an example, let me use a purchase order that would have 5 individual line items. Each of the individual line items has to have the entire quantity of that line item received, invoiced, and paid before that individual line item can be considered eligible for archiving. And then all the other line items within that purchase order has to be eligible for archiving as well before the header line item and the header itself will be considered eligible for archiving. So this can be both a blessing and a curse to the archivist, because the blessing is in the sense that the purchase order will only be removed if all 5 line items are eligible to be removed, and therefore it will take all 5 line items out during the archive and never leave any individual line item out there by itself. The curse on this, on the other side, is that if you have a purchase order with multiple line items, every one of those line items have to be completely received, invoiced, and paid before that header can be set for archiving. So it can be very frustrating to the archivist that certain pieces of information and data cannot be removed because something hasn't been completely closed. As part of our mission statement, we secondly will go into and look at the importance of legal compliance into reducing our corporate liability for our data management. We need to make sure that as we go through the archiving process, that initially we are taking the corporate policy out there for data and matching it up to the individual types of data that we're removing to make sure that it is completely in line with our corporate retention policy. We want to reduce the liability to the organization so that it cannot be used against us in a legal battle. There have been many cases that I've read about over the years where companies have kept data past its corporate lifetime, and that data was then eligible during the discovery process to be used by the suing company against the organization. And therefore, what you don't want to do is to provide data to the suing organization that is going to be able to use it against you. So it is best practice that once the end of that life cycle matches up to the corporate retention policy, that data is removed and destroyed. Thirdly, as part of our archiving mission statement, we want to bring forth the idea that archiving is not a one-time effort, but rather is an ongoing process. That we need to keep, since we are generating data every day in such a voluminous state, we want to be able to archive on a regular basis as well. Number one, to make sure that we are keeping in compliance with our corporate and legal requirements, but secondly, also to keep our systems small and our response times in line. The other reason we want to do archiving on a regular basis is because it demonstrates it as part of our standard business practices. This again becomes important from a legal perspective, because if we were to be served with a legal document for certain data and we destroy it the next day, well, any judge is going to know right away that that's the reason we destroyed the data, and we would definitely be in jeopardy of losing the case. But if we can prove that that particular data has been archived off and destroyed on a regular basis as part of our ongoing corporate business practices, then the courts and the judges have shown that they accept that, and we wouldn't be penalized because of it. So therefore, keeping an archiving strategy ongoing as a regular basis is a best practice. Another part of our mission statement is to provide the capability and training to quickly access archived data. Once we remove the data from the live database and put it on our storage medium, we need to be able to show the organization that that data is out there and can be retrieved on an individual document basis for questions or resolution of a particular problem, or that data can be brought back in total for a particular month or particular year, so that that data can be eligible for discovery in a legal situation or for an audit that has come up. And so we need to be able to show that we are easily able to provide access to that data and to be able to train the business community in order to be able to do that themselves. As we go through this process, there always seems to be a tension between the business and legal and IT. And so part of the tension from the business side is that they would like to keep the data in the system forever. They are comfortable with it, they know where it is, and they would like to be able to hold on to it as long as possible. From the IT side, they want to be able to remove the data as soon as possible and as much as possible, so that we can keep the system small, keep the system response times as good as possible, and to get a real handle on the overall size of our database. Similarly, the legal department wants to keep our data as small as possible in order to reduce the corporate liability that we just talked about a moment ago. So the way that we can best accomplish this task is a solution of a well-defined and a well-executed archiving strategy. And so in order to be able to put that together, we're going to now look at the key drivers to make that happen. The key drivers that we're going to be looking at as we go through this process are, from a legal perspective, reviewing our legal compliance and mitigation of risk. From a financial perspective, as we determine the financial reporting requirements and what their needs are. And thirdly, from a business side, in looking at what they need in order to be able to answer their particular questions. Now, we've talked so far about the legal team's responsibility in this process and why it's important from their perspective that they participate in this process. It is their job to develop the corporate policy for data retention and data destruction practices. It's not IT's function to do that. Rather, it's our job to execute those policies that have already been put into place. One of the things that I wanted to introduce at this time is a couple of the terminologies that we will use from a legal perspective. First being something called residence time. Residence time is how long we keep the data in the system, in the SAP system. This is mostly a determination from the business and the financial side as to how long they would like the data in the system in order for them to perform their daily and weekly activities. Most organizations follow the principle of keeping the data in the system for the current year plus the previous 2 years. So they have anywhere between 2 and 3 years of data in the system at any particular time, and they use that as a guideline to be able to handle most of the requirements that they have. On the other side, we have something that is called retention time. Retention time is how long we keep that data, whether in the system or in the storage medium, before it's destroyed. So the legal department is the ones who really are responsible for determining the retention time, as that then falls in line with our corporate responsibility of keeping it just as long as we need to and then removing it. The best practice that we're recommending here is that we include our ERP archiving policy in line with our corporate retention policy. As we go through the process, we will take the corporate retention policies for our data and match them up with specific business data that we find in the SAP system. We will try to make as clear a one-to-one match as possible so that we can make sure that we are in compliance and to be able to easily prove that compliance. And then once we have that established, it'll be an easy practice for us to follow going forward. Finally, we will look at developing data destruction guidelines. Once that data has reached the end of its life cycle and retention time has come, we then want to have a practice in place for getting sign-off from legal and finance that the data is not involved in a current audit, that the data is not involved in any kind of a legal suit, and that once we have their sign-off that there is nothing currently out there preventing that data from being destroyed, then we get a signature and a sign-off from them saying that we are authorized to do so, and then we execute the process of actually destroying the data and getting a certificate of destruction to prove that that data is no longer eligible to be recovered. From the financial side of the house, we want the finance team to validate the financial retention requirements, whereas they will determine how long they need to keep the data resident in SAP in order for them to perform their daily functions and to be able to support all of the corporate reporting functions that they are responsible for doing. And then we also want them to participate in the archive process decisions as to whether we need to segregate the data by organization, by company code, or by location. And so we need them as part of those decision-making processes. We need to have them participate in testing retrievals of data that has been archived in our test system to make sure that they are comfortable with bringing the data back and be able to report upon it. And then thirdly, we get a sign-off from them that they are good to go. And then we will identify any audit requirements that they see coming up for internal and external reporting considerations so that we're not removing data while they are trying to report on it. From a business owner responsibility, again, we need them to assess the business risk and identify retention periods for archiving procedures. So they need to tell us how long they need to keep a purchase order or a work order in the system so that they can continue to process it all the way through, keeping in mind that perhaps there's returns or rejects that have to be processed, so we can't remove the data and archive it before that happens. So they're part of that process. They will also help us to determine to see if there's any way that we can do some data prevention or data deletion opportunities. One of the things that I have come across as I've gone from every organization that I've been asked to participate in archiving in is that we find that there are many tables being filled with massive amounts of data that is either unnecessary or should never have been generated to begin with. So what we have normally is organizations that will go through the initial SAP implementation, and certain switches will be turned on that will generate data that either we didn't understand was going to be generated or didn't understand what it was that was being generated or how much was being generated, and that data just continues to grow and grow, and nobody ever needs it, nobody ever wants it. So a couple of things that we try to do here is to go back and look at Are there ways for us to change configuration that we no longer need to even generate the data, which is data prevention? Or if the data is out there and nobody needs it, nobody wants it, nobody has any use for it, and there's no legal or financial reason to keep it, then that we can just delete it, and then it'll be out of the system and it's no longer going to be generated as well. We will look for the business to participate in archiving process decisions. Again, how long do we need to keep it resident in SAP? Do we need to, when we need to archive, do we need to do it by company code or by location? Those kind of decisions. We'll help them with testing and testing retrievals, and finally get a sign off from them of the overall process. As mentioned, we may need to change business processes. Many times I'll go in an organization and we'll see that they didn't realize that at the end of the business process, it's their responsibility to turn on the archiving flag that this data is now business closed. That was never thought through and made as part of their process after the initial implementation. And so therefore we have a lot of data out there that needs to be cleansed. And once that data is cleansed, we need to incorporate the new process into the steps of our businesses so that we can properly finish off the purchase order process or the work order process or the quality control process and close it out when that data process has been. Briefly, I just want to highlight the database optimization techniques that are out there. Data prevention is where we will identify unnecessary and unused data, such as or FI documents, costing-based profitability analysis, LIS structures. All of these I've come across throughout the years that have been identified as something that is no longer needed, or that SAP has changed their business processes and this data is no longer functional, so this can be prevented from being out there. Then we have things like data deletion, that there are massive amounts of data logs or application logs or workflows or iDocs, RFC connections, that data is out there that nobody can read, understand, or ever use. So that data really doesn't even need to be archived. It can be straight deleted. And so we need to understand those pieces of data and how that can be managed. And then finally, we do have data archiving, where we will actually identify tables that contain certain pieces of information and incorporate them into an archive object. And so again, here I want to use some terminology and a definition of an archiving object. We have an archiving object out there, for example, for a purchase order. And a purchase order archiving object is made up of all of the individual tables that make up that purchase order. And so when the data is archived, it is all accumulated against that object, so that when a purchasing archive object is performed, it will pull the data for that particular purchase order that's being archived from every one of the tables from the purchasing side of the house, whether it's the purchase order header, the purchase order line item, those items that have been received, invoiced, and paid, all the notes, everything for that particular purchase order comes out of those tables, accumulated in the archive object, and then the archive object itself is stored in our